We're currently at a place where 58% of calories consumed in the US are ultra-processed foods.
She had 8 years of vegetarianism before I managed to convince her to start having steak for breakfast.
Iodine deficiency is the number one preventable cause of intellectual disability worldwide.
Have you had a baby, or are your daughter, granddaughter, or friend thinking about having a baby, even if it's just one day in the future? If you said yes, or maybe one day, today's conversation is for you. We're talking about the food we eat before and during pregnancy to create smart, healthy, and resilient children. And if you think this episode is just for pregnant women, think again, fellas. We have the author of 3 books, Real Food for Pregnancy, Real Food for Fertility, and Real Food for Gestational Diabetes on today's show, talking about why mainstream prenatal nutrition advice is creating undernourished babies and sets you up for unhealthy, unintelligent kids. Plus, why you shouldn't be scared of mercury in fish, why you shouldn't be scared of vitamin A, and why your vegan and vegetarian diet is a really bad idea for any IVF or pregnancy journey. We've got a lot squeezed into this episode today, and since this will literally affect the next generation, let's get into it. What's up, my healthy friends? This episode is one that I've been looking forward to for months now as I've gone along the journey of witnessing a pregnancy firsthand, or secondhand, maybe, one that I kind of created. And that experience has been fraught with all sorts of food challenges and my own nutrition knowledge and expertise feeling pretty much futile, to be totally honest. But before we start and get into that conversation, I just want you to know that this year it's my mission to coach 500 people to achieve real weight loss. And by real, I mean dealing with what's really weighing you down and not just the number on your scales. And if you want to look into how our health programs work and what they're like and what they involve and if they're right for you or you could benefit from them, then the link to chat with me or one of my team members is down in the show notes or the caption below. Now, I'd like to introduce you to this incredibly influential success story that is Lily Nichols. Lily is a researcher, a registered dietitian and nutritionist whose evidence-based approach has influenced prenatal nutrition policies around the world. Her book, Real Food for Pregnancy, which I've got right here, includes over 930 scientific citations and has become the go-to resource for healthcare providers worldwide. And those healthcare providers and practitioners are probably the ones that are stepping outside of the typical below-par conventional medical food advice, which I often rant about on this podcast. So we're talking superior nutrition here, which is what we're all about. So Lily, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You are so welcome. We were just talking before we hit record on some life advice for me coming up to this stage of life. But this conversation, talking about prenatal nutrition and fertility nutrition and all that kind of stuff is possibly a bit of a new world for a lot of people. And I'm guessing a lot of people listening also went through a phase where the advice was extraordinarily different, which is why I want to start the conversation with maybe a big question, but we can whittle it down. But in your experience, what's the sort of biggest gap between pregnant women where they are now in regards to nutrition advice from their doctor or health people or the internet versus what science is actually showing that pregnant women and mums are needing?
I mean, there's so many gaps. So where do I start? I mean, first and foremost, I think our conventional recommendations or just typically the type of advice that's relayed from a health practitioner to a pregnant woman tends to focus mostly on things that you need to avoid. Right? You go in for your first prenatal visit or maybe second. If you're given any nutrition advice at all, it's usually some form of like a pamphlet that says, do not eat these various foods. It doesn't tend to focus on what you should be eating more of for an optimally healthy pregnancy. It's like, these foods might be dangerous, don't touch them. That I have my own qualms with because it's rather arbitrary what happens to make it on the do not eat list. But I think we could do a lot better at leaning into what we should emphasize to optimize outcomes. I mean, a lot of prenatal care as a whole feels very, a bit reactionary. You're kind of looking for problems the whole way through and not a whole lot focused on preventative measures. The other part of the issue is that I'm sure it's the same down there as it is in the States. Prenatal advice really stems from, it's like an offshoot of the general dietary guidelines, which it sounds like you also have your own issues with. So, I mean, the macronutrient ratios, the nutrients that are kind of considered like bad for you, like saturated fat, cholesterol, salt, they're all those sorts of old school 1980s kind of thoughts about nutrition filter down into the pregnancy nutrition guidelines as well. And that ends up having, I don't know, even more of a deleterious effect in this stage of life because our nutrient requirements are higher for a lot of different vitamins and minerals that are found in the very foods that have saturated fat, cholesterol in them. And lo and behold, our sodium needs are actually higher during pregnancy, but they don't acknowledge this. One of the main things that I try to point out in my work is that there is a large gap between where our guidelines are at and where the latest research is, which is why I tend to lean in so much into like, oh, wow, this new study came out showing XYZ because our guidelines haven't caught up. So there's, typically about a 17-year gap between new research making it into clinical practice. And then it's even longer until those clinical practices make it into changes in our guidelines. So we're definitely decades behind where the research is with the types of guidelines that are given out nowadays.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you know, but I used to be a cancer researcher and work in a cancer lab. And it was always, the saying was, it was a translational research lab, but it was 30 years from bench top to bedside.
Wow.
Is the saying. And it moves so incredibly slow. And there's an enormous macroeconomic system behind, the medical system and cancer and pregnancy. But you would hope that with all of the amazing technology and resources that we have now, that could be expedited.
It's not that the research doesn't come out, but it's like the translational aspect or getting into policies and guidelines, that stuff. There's just so much bureaucracy and like committee opinion that affects and influences, and of course all the corporate interests, the lobbyists, all the politics of it that get in the way of that information making it direct to consumers. So, I only have a very small professional experience in the public policy side of things. I worked for the California Diabetes and Pregnancy Program. We had our own guidelines for gestational diabetes. And like, even with that, trying to shift even the tiniest little thing would be, 6 months of meetings with all the state level dietitians trying to like go back and forth on whether or not we should change something. And there's always going to be some people in the room that just want to keep everything exactly the same. And then there's always going to be change makers in the room who want to optimize. And then there's always going to be the people who are like, we don't have enough research to, even if the original guidelines were based on shoddy research, like changing them requires like exponentially more evidence for people to be willing to change them. It's like everybody's afraid to touch pregnancy guidelines because you don't want to do anything that could potentially harm a baby, like obviously, right? So
yeah,
this is why like people see my work as being so revolutionary. It's not that I'm saying things that nobody has ever said before, but like in the context of what's happening in pregnancy and speaking out about some of this stuff, that's stuff that most dietitians aren't comfortable touching, like nobody wants to touch the pregnancy guidelines. They're too scary. And I just really just dig into the data on it.
Yeah, it's one of those things that Yali, my partner, and I have really learnt is because I obviously have a background in nutrition and I did pregnancy nutrition at uni. And obviously during this journey, I've just gone really deep on all of the things. And one of the good things about social media is that it allows a real jump. Let's say that jump, that translational journey is 30 years. One of the good things is that, we're able to have people, whether they're just mums, whether they're researchers, whether they're this podcast, sort of read the research and get it to people really fast. And maybe it lacks a little bit of context, but we're seeing a lot of people benefit from all of the work that you do and all of the information or a lot of the information that people share. But I think that's one of the fundamental issues with modern medicine is the conservative nature. And maybe this came from the culture of the US because it feels like medicine is so conservative because every step of the way, the doctor, the nurse, the supplier, the producer, everybody's worried about being sued, right? And so the idea of changing something and possibly putting yourself at risk of being sued, even though if it makes like total sense from a nutritional perspective, it's, everybody's terrified of getting in legal trouble. And that's a reasonable concern. But I would argue that maybe in cancer as well, actually, I would definitely argue in cancer as well, our conservatism is to massive detriment of the health of people.
Right.
But because it's written in policy, I've still got to make the poor choice to legally protect myself rather than give advice that would be better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, this is true for a lot of things, right? Obstetricians, too. They're just going to go with whatever the policy guideline is because then they have a legal backing if something goes wrong. So, yeah, I would agree with you. It does hold us back.
Yeah, totally. So further to that, I guess we had a scenario with Yali where she had 8 years of vegetarianism before I managed to convince her to start having steak for breakfast, which we just did before I jumped on this podcast. And so her iron was really low and, getting lower and lower during pregnancy because obviously the baby needed it, not her. And even the doctor that we were seeing, we mostly saw naturopaths and sort of natural health professionals, but we needed to sort of tick some medical boxes to get access to some things. But even the doctor with her ferritin at 4 said,
Wow.
I don't think we need an infusion. And I said, why? Like I was in the appointment very direct, also able to sort of talk the lingo a little bit. And she said, there's too many risks. There's too many risks. And I was like, isn't there greater risks for not having
unusual.
enough iron? Yeah. But it just highlights that conservatism.
Wow. In the States, they would have given an iron infusion with a ferritin of 4. So there you go, right? Different risk aversion, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, eventually we got one, but she refused until the hemoglobin was low enough, essentially.
Wow.
But there was a
Interesting.
multiple month record of it just going down. But it was just doctors are just scared of making the wrong mistakes or the wrong choices. So, but from a nutritional perspective and the guidelines that you've sort of referenced so far, like what are the big ones? Because I know as soon as we found out we were having a baby, like all of the voices about vitamin A and, avoiding vitamin A and liver, you're going to cause all sorts of issues with your baby. Maybe can we just touch on some of the big ones that are just, incorrectly interpreted or totally wrong?
Yeah. So the vitamin A one that's a big one. That often puts liver on the do not eat list because liver is high in preformed vitamin A.
A lot of people don't have an issue not eating liver, though.
I know,
because they think it's so gross.
Right? It's rare that somebody is going to overdo liver if it's something that they're just like eating in their normal diet. I will say nowadays with so many people taking organ meat supplements, I do sometimes have to be like, hey, just watch how much you're having of that and how much is coming in from your prenatal. But anyways, the concern over vitamin A stems from some studies in the 1990s where they supplemented pregnant women with high doses of synthetic vitamin A and then looked at whether the rates of birth defects were higher in those women. And some of the studies showed a slightly higher rate of birth defects. Other ones did not show that effect. But nonetheless, that is where there came this cap of 10,000 IUs per day of preformed vitamin A in pregnancy. What's interesting is if you look at the research on supplementing or taking liver, eating liver specifically, like natural forms of vitamin A, versus the synthetic forms that are in isolated supplements, you do not see that teratogenic effect. I mean, they're metabolized a little bit differently. They don't have the same spike in sort of toxic metabolites that you can get with the synthetic vitamin A. So it really has more to do with supplements than it does with liver. That said, I take a conservative approach on this, right? And I do not recommend people consume an amount of liver that would have them exceeding 10,000 IUs of vitamin A on a regular basis. So I have for the people who don't have my book, because I do go into it in there too. I also have a blog article on my website on liver and organ meats and pregnancy that goes through all the different qualms about the organ meats and liver, how to make them taste good, how much to have, what about the vitamin A concern, is it a replacement for a prenatal? I go through all that stuff in that article. But suffice it to say, I really don't have concerns over a small intake of liver, approximately 3 to 6 ounces per week, which is far more than most women are going to consume. But from a vitamin A perspective, I recommend keeping it below 6 ounces per week. And part of the reason that I encourage liver and organ meat consumption is because they're so rich in a number of micronutrients. I mean, we look at vitamin A as this boogeyman that we need to avoid. but there are actually certain birth defects that are caused by vitamin A deficiency. Congenital diaphragmatic hernia is one of them, by the way, which rates of that have been on the rise in recent years because vitamin A deficiency is so prevalent because people aren't consuming their animal foods and animal fats like we once did. But it has beneficial roles in the development of a number of different organs. We just don't want to get ridiculous with our, supplemental levels of intake. Another one that I think needs to be reformed, our choline recommendations are way out of date. So choline is actually the most recent micronutrient in the US anyways to be added to the list of essential nutrients, meaning you need to consume a dietary source for your body to function well. But that was set based on data purely in adult men that they then adjusted via mathematical estimates for women based on their size and then for pregnancy, fetal brain development, and whatnot. So yes, they acknowledge you probably need more in pregnancy. You need even more during breastfeeding. But when we actually look at the data, that's the studies specifically in pregnancy, and we have randomized controlled trials at this point, which is very rare for micronutrients in pregnancy. But they've compared different intakes of choline. You have one group that's meeting the current recommended amount, and you have another group that's getting double that amount. And you look at infant brain development. They've now completed this study up to, the children have been reported on up to age 7. And they have optimal brain development, reaction time, cognitive function. All the things are better in the group of children who were prenatally exposed to higher choline intake. Now, the reason this, I think, is important is because if you follow the conventional prenatal guidelines, you're not going to eat enough choline. You're probably not going to even hit the recommended amount, which is probably set twice as low as it should be. But you're probably not even going to hit that because our most choline-rich foods are liver and organ meats, egg yolks, and primarily animal foods. You'll find it in your meat, your dairy products, and so on and so forth. And then you have pretty tiny amounts in some plant foods, nuts and seeds, legumes, cruciferous vegetables, shiitake mushrooms. But you're not going to get anywhere close to the amount you need unless you're eating these animal foods that we've been told not to eat for unsubstantiated reasons, whether it's the cholesterol, the saturated fat, the vitamin A, whatever. So that is one where unless we reform our guidelines, no one's going to be hitting the choline intakes. And that doesn't even get into the incorrect information that's shared about consuming eggs in pregnancy, where you have a whole group of women who are afraid of consuming eggs over concerns over salmonella, that the risk of that is way overblown. If you actually look at the data, it's pretty rare that you're going to be consuming a salmonella infected egg, but nonetheless, I've definitely worked with clients who are I'm not eating eggs anymore because of salmonella risk. I'm okay, wait. They didn't even tell you not to eat eggs at all. They just said cook them a little more. But even that is, unsubstantiated recommendations.
Yeah, well, and I think as you're aware, it's just mums that are concerned thinking, well, if there's a risk at all, I should just avoid it. They're just trying to do the best that they can, but at the consequence of not getting the nutrition in at all. And I think the other thing that's worth noting in this whole conversation is that the food landscape, as you know, of course, Lily, but it's just getting worse and worse every year. And we're getting more ultra-processed foods. And so we're having, I guess, women and the men that, help create these kids eating such poor diets that, it's all the stuff that's going on with ADHD, autism, all of this stuff. Surely it's got something to do. And I know that I'm not sitting here blaming mothers for the way that they ate during pregnancy because everybody was doing the best that they could. But equally, in some way, I feel I have a sense of responsibility to use this platform to let people know that there is situations and circumstances where we need to do better. And I think that pregnancy nutrition is one of them because we're producing such a generation of snowflakes or multiple generations of people that have no resilience, no ability to focus. And we can blame screens, we can blame vaccines, we can blame, there's lots of things in that conversation. But I think the thing that we have the most control over is what we put in our face, in theory. Acknowledging too that there's a whole economic, inflation conversation going on there too. But like, I've never met a parent that didn't want their kid to be healthy and strong, right?
Oh, yeah. And I mean, even on the economic side of things, early on in my career, I was working with very low-income women in Los Angeles facing high-risk pregnancies. I worked in a perinatology office doing a lot of gestational diabetes work. And even if resources are scarce, these women still want the best possible outcomes. So, I mean, they might not be able to afford like the highest quality prenatal vitamin or something like that, but there's still a lot you can do in terms of optimizing your diet quality on a very tight budget. It just requires that we look at food differently. We're currently at a place where 58% of calories consumed in the US are ultra processed foods. That is the probably if that's the like message that I can get across from this whole conversation, that's the most important. Like, that's the elephant in the room. We have all these health influencers talking about all these random things to supplement with this nutrient or not, to take methylene blue or not, red light therapy, all these like shiny object things. I'm like, the elephant in the room is the ultra processed foods. Like, yes, there's always room to optimize and play around with all sorts of little hacks and devices and whatever. But for the vast majority of the population, that's the issue that needs addressing. Because when you're consuming the ultra processed foods, it's not just that you're eating things that are not providing a whole lot of nutritional value, but you're not eating things that are providing you with protein, micronutrients, all sorts of different things that you need to thrive. And when it comes to having a baby, I mean, sometimes people will be kind of, I don't know, I get some harsh reviews sometimes on my book because by default, to talk about the importance of certain nutrients for a baby's development, we have only learned through studies looking at poor nutrition or lower levels of certain nutrients that you can have a bad outcome, right? So we only know that like iodine supports brain development because of what we've observed when pregnant women don't consume enough iodine and the fetus has an iodine deficiency. Likewise, vitamin B12, DHA, choline, iron, zinc. I mean, you could go nutrient by nutrient, like sort of tallying up the data that's on it, but we're often looking at, well, what happens when you don't get enough of this? And what's the consequence? And then so the opposite response the message I try to get across is, how can we optimize, right? How can we make sure that you are as nourished as possible? Because there is a finite window of time that your baby is going through certain developmental stages. People talk about, folate and the prevention of neural tube defects. I mean, that neural tube is closing between 5 to 6 weeks of pregnancy. Like, you have like 1 to 2 weeks at the earliest from when you find out that you're pregnant, right? Because of the way that pregnancies are, it's last menstrual period. So like when you're 4 weeks pregnant, you're really technically only 2 weeks past when you conceived, but it's counted from last menstrual period, right? So at 5 to 6 weeks of pregnancy per last menstrual period dating, like that neural tube has closed. And so your opportunity, this is why all the public health messaging, even if they're recommending the wrong type of folate, that's another rabbit hole.
Yeah, I want to get into that one.
That's why all the public health messaging is around optimizing folate intake pre-conception, because you don't have a large enough window of time to correct a folate deficiency, which could lead to a really serious physical defect in the baby, right? And it's not just folate, it's choline, it's methionine, it's glycine, it's B12. There's all these other nutrients that potentially are involved in neural tube defects, but you can expand on that into other sorts of suboptimal development, right? That can happen at other stages in the pregnancy where there might not be a physical defect, because the majority of those really are happening in the first like 12 weeks of pregnancy when all the organs, 8 weeks really, when all the organs are forming. But you can have, a baby has, 10 fingers, 10 toes, everything looks good, but maybe they're like not hitting their milestones when they should. Like that can be a manifestation of a number of different nutrient deficiencies. And we're not doing a great job from like a public health standpoint, from doctors, OBGYNs who often get almost zero training in nutrition, if they get any, on educating on that. This is a time when we should be like making sure that mothers are as well nourished as humanly possible so we can have the best, possible outcomes with the pregnancy, not only baby's development, but preventing pregnancy and birth complications as well.
Yeah, it's such a minefield. And I want to ask about the folate thing, but the other thing that comes up when you like referencing the fear around eggs is also the fear around seafood and fish and the mercury sort of aspect of that and whether you can have too much and what's damaging. But from reading your book, it seems like women that eat more fish seem to have more intelligent kids with bigger IQs, higher IQs. So what can we demystify that fish mercury fear that people have?
Yeah, I've written at length on this. I address it in Real Food for Pregnancy, and I actually wrote like a follow-up blog article on fish consumption and pregnancy, answering the question of, can you consume too much, right? So the concern over mercury technically is well-founded because mercury is a neurotoxin and it can accumulate in a developing brain and cause neurodevelopmental issues. So yes, it's something we should be aware of. The way that this is interpreted, though, is instead of just sharing the actual guidelines, which say avoid high mercury fish, people are saying don't eat any fish. And that is not the best message to get across. So first of all, not all of the mercury, let's assume we're doing our due diligence and choosing low mercury fish, which I think is a logical recommendation. Most types of smaller fish are lower mercury. Sardines, for example, even up to the size of like salmon or something, they're going to be lower mercury than like a huge tuna that's like hundreds of pounds, okay? Assume we're doing our due diligence on that. Even the small amount of mercury that you might be finding in your low mercury fish, the majority of it is not actually absorbed because fish is also high in selenium. And selenium prevents mercury from exerting its toxic effects in our system. So there's a protective mechanism there. And this has been really well documented. I'm not just like making it up. You can find all sorts of studies going into this phenomena of this like mercury, selenium. A lot of times there's like, for every toxic metal, there's going to be one or more nutritive minerals that counteract or like interfere with the toxic effects of this other heavy metal. So in the case of mercury, selenium is that mineral. The other part that we need to consider is like, okay, you have somebody who doesn't eat any fish. Now, what are the potential nutritional deficiencies that we've created by not consuming any fish or seafood? And everybody's quick to point to omega-3s like DHA and just like, well, just supplement with DHA. It's no big deal. You could do an algae-based DHA. You're good. Well, there's other stuff in fish beyond just the DHA. And this is the part that I don't think gets across in most of the prenatal resources that I see. So it's not just the DHA. It's the choline, the vitamin B12, the selenium, the iodine. That one's really key because fish is our primary source. Fish and seafood are our primary source of iodine. Next to that, eggs and dairy products, but not nearly the concentrations. Fish also has high amounts of taurine, which is a really beneficial amino acid, been shown to help promote like bone development in babies, for example. Fish is a fairly rare dietary source of vitamin D, so that can be beneficial in different ways. I mean, there's a lot going on. And depending on what else a woman is eating, if she's already eating an omnivorous diet, she may be getting a lot of those things already. But if, say, she's a pescatarian and now she's cut out fish, and now basically she's a lacto-ovo-vegetarian, well, now we have like a number of nutritional gaps in the diet that are not being filled. For people who want to kind of dive into fish a little more, I do recommend that blog article I have on fish and pregnancy because it goes through some really interesting data just off the top of my head. It's huge, like meta-analysis of 100,000 plus mother-infant pairs. And they were looking at like, is there a level of fish consumption at which it is now net harmful to baby's brain development? And they couldn't find a level at which it was associated with harm, even among individuals who were eating up to 100 ounces of seafood per week. Okay. It was still net beneficial to baby's brain development. And this held true even when they accounted for mercury exposure. And some of the studies measured like maternal mercury levels. And even in the mothers who had higher mercury levels, if that mercury was coming from fish and seafood, it was still, their baby's brain development was still net benefit, still better. If that mercury was coming from other sources, net negative effect. So it's like the mercury in fish, because of that selenium situation and probably all the other micronutrient benefits you're getting, helps offset the concerns over, potential toxin exposure from it as well.
Yeah, that's so good to hear. Did you say 100 ounces?
Yes.
Yeah, wow. That's
like massive.
For us in the metric system, that's 2.8 kilos a week.
Yes. So these
that's
are in, so this meta-analysis, obviously a meta-analysis is looking at lots of different studies. So it's including like island-dwelling populations who have huge fish intake. So yeah, there was no level. Because I mean, typically I'm recommending, and like the US FDA says, about 12 ounces of fish per week. And I kept getting this question like, well, when is it too much? Like, what if I eat 16 ounces of fish per week or 20 ounces of fish per week? I'm like, that's a good question. Like, normally this is not really a concern because the average US woman eats about 3 ounces of fish, if that, every week. So, but for those individuals, I was like, let me dive in, see what I can find. And lo and behold, found this really amazing study answering the exact question.
Yeah, you mentioned seafood and fish as a number one source of iodine. And I think maybe listeners of this podcast are probably familiar with iodine in the context of thyroid. But in regards to baby development and brain and nervous system, can you just talk about the importance of that and the consequence of, or the long-term consequence to the baby or child of an iodine deficiency during pregnancy?
Yeah, so I believe it was a study from the Journal of the American Medical Association, quote something to the effect that iodine deficiency is the number one preventable cause of intellectual disability worldwide.
Wow.
Iodine deficiency does play, like, it affects maternal thyroid hormone, of course, but maternal thyroid function on its own affects baby's brain development, but iodine itself seems to play a role as well. So it's really tricky. I think some of this is related to, we're so highly exposed to chemicals that are interfering with iodine utilization in the body, all the halides like your chlorine and your bromine. And we have those, you have the chlorine cleaning the water. You got all the bromines, the brominated vegetable oil added to the foods. We have brominated flame retardants. With the chlorine, we have all sorts of chlorinated chlorocarbons. Many of our persistent organic pollutants are precisely these like chlorine attached to a carbon atom kind of compounds, and they're highly toxic and they displace iodine from our body. And then you have these chlorocarbons and all these other sorts of chemicals taking the place on your thyroid hormone, interfering with its ability to actually function in your system. So it's a major one, and it's a really tricky one because I don't know if it's different with the Australian food databases, but in the US, we don't have really great data on iodine concentrations in different foods. So if you try to I'll just see and tally up that I'm getting enough, you can't get an accurate measure on it because most of our databases don't even report on iodine concentrations, and they're going to vary quite a bit in foods anyways, like in cow's milk. We used to disinfect cow udders with an iodine solution, and now a lot of farmers use a different solution that doesn't contain iodine or might even contain some type of bromide compound, which will have an opposite effect, right? So even the amount of iodine that's in milk, that's going to vary. But if you test, maternal iodine status, I mean, I've never had a client that's tested sufficient in iodine. It really is ridiculous. It's ridiculous that I think in Australia, I've heard that iodine is pretty commonly recommended as a supplement, and it's not as commonly recommended in the US. So a lot of the prenatals on the market in the US don't even have iodine or don't have sufficient amounts. My understanding is down there, iodine and folic acid are kind of one and the same. They're very commonly recommended. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, low iodine status in pregnancy is like highly associated with childhood IQ,
Hmm.
highly associated. And then you find the opposite effect with some of the halide compounds like fluoride exposure, which can
Yeah.
also get in the way of iodine function in your body. So you have higher fluoride exposure, lower IQ, higher iodine exposure, higher IQ. So
Yeah.
it really is one that if you're not consuming fish and seafood and also eggs and dairy products, you're probably going to want to make sure that your prenatal vitamin has some iodine and has sufficient amounts.
Yeah. One of the things that, and the reason that I said in the intro that my nutrition knowledge in Yarli's pregnancy was futile is because for the first 4 months of that pregnancy, she had hyperemesis gravidarum very,
Yeah.
very severely. And so she lost 4 kilos in trimester one, and she's
Wow.
already quite a slender woman. And so it was horrible for her, obviously, but it was torture for me knowing all of this stuff about nutrition and having all the books on the shelf and the textbooks and being so concerned about that. So fortunately, very fortunate, it didn't last 9 months, which it does for some women. But
Yeah.
after about 4 months, it sort of started to subside and took about 4 weeks for her to get back to normal. But one of the ways she was very sort of sensitive about what foods she felt comfortable with. And so there hasn't been much seafood. There's been a lot of prawns, actually, now I think about it. There hasn't been a lot of seafood in Yarli's pregnancy. So one way that we tried to supplement, because every time she tried to take a supplement, she would just gag, basically. She had that sort of trauma response to supplementation. But the way that we tried to supplement it was with gamasio. So basically, it's essentially Himalayan sea salt with sort of lightly baked sesame seeds, and then use a mortar and pestle to grind those up so they're actually digestible. And that was the sort of recipe. And just getting Yarli to put gamasio on literally everything because it's a salt
has
kind of additive.
Seaweed in it too, doesn't it? Usually.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that was the way that we tried to get some iodine into the diet.
Yeah. I mean, every little bit adds up, and you do have to get creative sometimes with how to get the foods down the hatch. And, hyperemesis is like a whole another ball game for people who've never seen that or experienced it. I mean, I was lucky to not experience that in my pregnancy, minus just a little nausea, not a ton of vomiting, but certainly the like foods that don't sound good. But hyperemesis takes it to a whole nother level. And I have to offer a lot of reassurance to people on this because, especially in the early portion of pregnancy, so hopefully this is helpful to anyone who's currently pregnant listening, especially if you're super nauseous right now. But like the embryo first implants into the endometrial lining and is nourished by what's called endometrial glands. So essentially, when you think about like leading up to pregnancy, your monthly cycle and how you shed your endometrium as a menstrual period every month, like that is actually that unshed menstrual blood that is this lush like lining for that embryo to implant in. That is actually the primary nourishment for that embryo up until the point that the placenta has fully formed. It like invades into the endometrial lining. You got like blood vessels connecting you, and you have like a direct supply to mom's blood supply at that point via the umbilical cord. I mean, those early months are really heavily nourished by the endometrium. So if I can give any nod to preconception nutrition, given that we really can't always control what symptoms are going to come our way in pregnancy, nor even sometimes what we're able to eat, which is just, it feels terrible when you like know and want to be eating better, but you literally physically cannot by any means eat differently at that time. If you've had any sort of like emphasis on your preconception nutrition and tried to like optimize your menstrual cycle health and build up your nutrient stores and whatnot, you can feel a bit reassured that you have some nutrient reserves to pull from during this time period. Moreover, another thing I like to point out is a lot of these studies where we've done a specific nutrient intervention that's associated with some sort of better outcomes for the pregnancy or for the baby's development, just because of the difficulty of trying to like recruit study participants at like week 4 of or 6 of pregnancy or whatnot.
Yeah.
Many of these interventions aren't starting until the 2nd trimester or sometimes even the 3rd trimester. And they still show benefit. So I write about this. I wrote a whole blog called Am I Too Late to Benefit from Nutrition Changes in Pregnancy or something to that effect. If you search too late on my blog, it should pop up just to offer some reassurance that if you go through a rough patch, it's not like your pregnancy is suddenly ruined and your baby's going to be dumb or something, we're a lot more resilient than that. So even if you're only able to get a handful of good meals down in the span of a week, it still is you're still okay, keep up your fluids and electrolytes as best as you can and get through this survival period and you will be okay. It really is going to be okay.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's going to be very reassuring for people. And I guess, and we've had to, it's almost like training for parenting is particularly for me of being I have to let go of control and, baby will take what it needs out of mum's bones and organs and everything, and it's going to be fine. And the second that it's born, then I can get to it.
And she'll be really hungry too, because your nutrient demands go up so much postpartum that, don't be surprised if she's out eating you in early postpartum. I certainly out ate my husband postpartum.
I am so fine with that.
I'm thanks for breakfast. Can you make me the same thing again? That wasn't enough. Yeah.
Oh, so you said before as well that the window in order for folate and that type of thing to get in and really do its job sort of closes quickly, or the impact of the folate would be more beneficial focusing on it prenatally. So can we touch on that subject of folate, folic acid? There's a lot about MTHFR mutations as well. Where is that important? Why is it important? Folate versus folic acid. Can we just get into that?
Yeah. So it gets more complicated than it needs to be, but I'll try to break it down as briefly as possible. And then I have a bunch of resources that I can point people to. Mm-hmm. So folate is an umbrella term for vitamin B9. And there are many different types of folate. You have the folate that naturally occurs in food, and there's over 150 different types of folate that naturally occur in food, though the type that makes up the majority of the folate in food is in a form called methylfolate. And then in supplement land and fortified grains, we have a form called folic acid. And folic acid is a synthetic form of folate that is made in a laboratory. It doesn't exist in nature. The food folates, as they call them, have a much more complex structure. There's a lot of extra sort of things attached to them, so to speak. So folic acid is a very simplistic oxidized structure. It's very stable, so it works well in terms of fortifying foods. And we had some research from the 90s showing that supplementation with folic acid could reduce the risk of neural tube defects. And they decided to start fortifying the refined grain supply with it in the US, and they've done so in many other countries worldwide. Mm-hmm. The problem with the folic acid is that it's not metabolized the same as food folates. And there's a lot of misinformation on folic acid that you have to use very specific language to get it right. So folic acid is absorbed really well. Okay, you absorb it from your intestinal tract really well, but it is not well utilized, because in order for it to have the effect of natural folate in your system, it has to be methylated first. You have to convert it into methylfolate, because methylfolate is 95 to 98% of the folate in your body, and even in cord blood in baby's body, is in the form of methylfolate. And folic acid sort of puts a strain on that methylation process, because you have to provide so many methyl groups to methylate it, and there's only so much that your body can handle at one time. So we can process some, maybe 200 to maybe 300 micrograms of folic acid per day, but not all individuals can process it well. And so if you have you could consider it a defect or like a variation in the function of an enzyme called MTHFR. Your body has a reduced ability to metabolize folic acid. And so those individuals have a much more difficult time with it. And so you can supplement with all the folic acid you want, and it's not going to raise their like red blood cell folate levels, like where it actually counts. They just have a buildup of what they call unmetabolized folic acid in their bloodstream. You can look it up in the research. It's called FA, unmetabolized folic acid. So it depends on which type of MTHFR variation you have. There's different types. Like you can get super into the weeds on this. I teach a whole 2-hour webinar on folate and methylation as it relates to fertility and pregnancy if people really want to go into it. So we're at Women's Health and Nutrition Academy. But suffice it to say, it doesn't matter whether you know your genetic status or not, whether you have an MTHFR variation or not. Half the population approximately does. I do. It really is a matter of are you consuming or taking a form that your body can easily metabolize? And ultimately that ends up being methylfolate for the most part, or there's another form called folinic acid, which sounds like folic acid, but there's an extra in there, folinic acid, which is one step removed from methylfolate that can also be utilized. So it kind of, it depends on how nitpicky you want to get about the type of folate that you're taking. But if you know that you have an MTHFR variation, folic acid is just going to be pretty difficult for your body to metabolize. So I really try to lean into the food folates. Liver tends to be a really excellent source of folate. That's actually more concentrated in folate than our plant foods. But then a number of plant foods like, spinach, legumes, sunflower seeds, they could be really good sources of folate as well. Liver, leafy greens, and legumes, the 3 L's. And for anyone who's if you're listening to me and you think I sound like a crazy person and you've heard some very loud, social media OBGYNs, many of whom come after me with threats and stuff because they're folic acid is the way. I really encourage you to read my article on my website on folate. I go into a lot of this in more detail and cite everything. I have the receipts. And then if you want to go deeper, there's a webinar. Because believe it or not, even after it's a very long article, 7,000 or 9,000 words, there's still more to say because this topic has so much nuance.
You're in good company on this podcast. We often push the envelope of conventional ideas, which attracts some negative attention. Yarli and I did a podcast letting everyone know we're planning a home birth. That episode got us a 1-star review because obviously somebody thinks that's a terrible idea.
Oh, yes. Well, as somebody who had both my babies at home, I think that's a great idea. So,
okay, great.
Yes. Yes.
The thing that as I'm listening to you speak, and a lot of the references are to animal protein, and knowing, Yarli was a veggie for 8 years, and we realized, Yarli discovered that she had a lot of deficiencies coming into this pregnancy, which was always on the cards for us, but happened a lot sooner. We were in the process of getting our nutrients and our health back, and it just happened way too quickly. Her body was like, oh, you've been eating steak for a month? It's already time.
Yeah.
But I'm assuming that there's some degree of concern nutritionally in general for vegans and vegetarians, and more so for vegans. That's how I feel in the nutrition world in general, but definitely for pregnancy. How do you feel about it?
I agree with you. Yeah. I snuck in a little section into Real Food for Pregnancy on nutritional considerations for vegetarian diets and some of the challenges there. That really focuses mostly on the micronutrient considerations. In conventional dietetics land, they'll tell you that a vegetarian or vegan diet is safe for all life stages, including pregnancy, breastfeeding, infancy, early childhood. I disagree, and I find their arguments are incomplete. They only address a handful of micronutrients of concern in those documents. I mean, I've read all the policy papers, right? That's what I do. I dig into the guidelines and I'm like, what evidence did you use to back up XYZ? That's kind of shoddy evidence. So they don't address all of the micronutrients of concern. So yes, they might have you supplement with B12 and algae-based DHA, they might mention a couple nutrients of concern, but not tell you how to actually meet those with a realistic, like, vegan meal plan. Like, you cannot create a choline sufficient, unsupplemented vegan meal plan. You can't. I've tried. I've put the offer out to anybody in the ethers to do so. I think I had one guy who sent me like a completely ridiculous, 4,000 calories, and every single food in there was a high choline vegan food. So it was all like legumes, Brussels sprouts, like 2 cups of shiitake mushrooms, like all this stuff that's like, yeah, that's not actually how people eat.
Not even
And
close.
Also way more calories than, we need, and deficient in all these other things. But you just run into a number of issues. So I think you have to be kind of cautious with how you approach it. Since my angle is all about optimizing, right? It's like, how can we optimize your nutrient intake, your pregnancy outcomes, your baby's brain development? And if I'm looking at what's optimal, it simply is not optimal. I think you can run into a number of pretty significant challenges down the road. So, for example, I know some women maybe they did have a vegan pregnancy, everything seemed fine, but then as their baby's teeth start coming in, like the baby teeth are coming in rotted, right? Like that could be vitamin D or K2 deficiency. It could be mineral deficiency. Any of those are potentially possible. I mean, everybody, omnivore or not, needs to be thinking about vitamin D, but with vitamin K2, outside of natto, which most people otherwise, unless you're living in Japan or something where it's like a part of your normal diet, most people aren't consuming natto, right? So unless you're consuming natto and unless your prenatal vitamin has K2, the only sources are animal foods. With the, calcium, yes, you could get calcium from plant foods, but typically a lot of vegetarians and vegans are not quite hitting the mark on calcium because it's pretty hard to get it just from your broccoli and almonds. Like, look up at what serving of sesame seeds or tahini you need to get the equivalent amount of calcium as an ounce of cheese, like it's a lot. So these things just become rather unreasonable sometimes to meet the nutrient requirements in a typical diet. And I don't know, because this topic is so hot button, it's also hits very close to home for me because I'm a former vegetarian. I have family members and loved ones who still follow a vegan diet. I wrote a whole chapter actually on vegetarian and vegan diets in Real Food for Fertility. And even though that's not specific to the pregnancy timeframe, we're talking more about hormonal health and preconception. The reason I mention that as a resource is that I get into a lot more of the weeds on like the macronutrient balance, the fat quality, the amino acids. People are always so quick to point out protein now. Oh, well, I could just combine my incomplete proteins. I got my whole grain rice and I got my black beans and I have a complete protein and I'm fine. No, you're not fine, because the concentration of protein, the quality of the protein, the amino acid balance, it is not one and the same as animal foods. And so in Real Food for Fertility, I go much more in depth on those sorts of aspects that people usually use to defend a vegetarian or vegan diet. And then I go into more specifics on like, now what's your game plan if you're now going to reintroduce animal foods, as many people who read my work do decide to reintroduce animal foods. How are you going to do it? Because I get so many practical questions about like, well, where do I start? What do I add first? Should I do this or that? And it's like, there's not a right or wrong way to do it, but I kind of walk through some different options with you. So it's like a very like, I don't know, I like to think that I kind of hold your hand through it. And I'm also not preaching at you. I'm just letting the data speak for itself, because so much of the reason that people were persuaded to do a vegetarian or vegan diet in the first place is that they were evangelized into it. It becomes almost like a religious belief in a way, and you're sold some information. Like, the reasons can be so widespread, like all the different reasons somebody might choose it. It might have nothing to do with nutrition. It might simply be an animal rights issue or an environmental concern or something like that. But if your reason was nutritional, I'm going to give you the facts on that. And most people who end up reading it change their mind on continuing with that way of eating. They might not be, a huge meat eater or something, but they usually start incorporating at least some animal foods back into their system. And resoundingly, the feedback that I get is just a night and day difference in their energy levels, their menstrual cycle, their fertility, like people conceiving super quickly after adding back animal foods. I hear that a lot. Yeah, I have some wild stories of like couples who were, trying to conceive for over 10 years and then, reintroduce animal foods and like conceived, yeah, it's wild.
I've heard stories as well of people that have paid lots of money for IVF and then it didn't work. And then they were like, all right, we'll finally have a steak or go off the vegan or vegetarian. And it was like 2 or 3 months later, pregnant.
Yeah. So we go into like all sorts of interesting data because a lot of that, it's not just the micronutrient deficiencies, but some of those amino acids that are only found in animal foods are really beneficial to reproductive hormone levels, endometrial health, egg quality, sperm quality. So like the carnitine, the creatine, the taurine, there's a lot going on there beyond just like correcting a vitamin B12 deficiency or an iron deficiency, right? It's like it goes way deeper than the sort of surface level conversations people have about vegetarianism.
Yeah. Well, your book is amazing. Your work is amazing. I'm a huge fan and I'm glad that we've got to have this conversation and hopefully we can have some more because I've got lots of other stuff to ask you. But for everybody that's listening now and wants to either get this book for their daughter or their partner or a friend or themselves, where can everybody find you and your work online?
So the best place to find me is my website, lilynicholsrdn.com. There's a tab for the books. So just click on that. Amazon, I think, is the easiest place, especially if you're in Australia, for example. Let's see, on my site, I give away the first chapter of Real Food for Pregnancy for free. So check that out. There's a number of other things on the freebie tab. I've referenced several blog articles. There's no paywall on my site. Just click the blog tab and you have literally hundreds of articles that are all free, going through a lot of different information. Many times I'm like, maybe touching on a topic that I covered in the book, but from a different angle or following up on reader questions like the fish article, can I eat too much? But really spend some time on there. There's just absolute ton of resources. I don't know, search around. There's a lot going on. And then social media land, you can find me on Instagram. My handle is lilynicholsrdn.
Perfect. I will put all of those links down below so everybody can check out your content, but also search for some of those blogs that you referenced throughout the conversation as well. And I guess for us to round out this conversation, with all of the amazing information you have about health and wellness and food, what is one piece of health information you wish more people knew about?
I guess we didn't touch on this one in our talk today, but one that I mention a lot is getting a sufficient amount of protein at breakfast. If we're going to be specific here, I would say animal protein of some form. It tends to work a lot better, but like, eggs, leftover meat, Greek yogurt, cottage cheese, like, even fish. Hey, like whatever floats your boat in the morning. It doesn't have to be like traditional breakfast foods as we think of them. Mm-hmm. If people could just give themselves like a 3-day experiment where they hit 25, 30, 35 or so, depending on your body size, maybe more, grams of protein at breakfast. So speaking for women specifically, like no less than 25 grams of protein at breakfast. We're not talking about gram weight of your chicken breast. I'm talking about like the actual grams of protein in a serving of chicken. Okay. Mm-hmm. See how you feel. Do like a 3-day experiment and see how you feel. Because 99% of the time, people feel so dramatically better. Their energy levels, their cravings, their afternoon slump, whatever, that like all the shiny object stuff floating around social media on the supplement or the device or whatever that you need for optimal health, like most of your problems have already been solved by just getting enough protein at breakfast.
Yes.
So that's my major takeaway, even though we didn't spend much time on breakfast in our conversation today. Give yourself a 3-day experiment.
No, I'm all for it. All for it. It's so funny because I just got back from the gym and a woman was asking me my professional opinion on Ozempic and Wegovy, and we got into a conversation about breakfast, and she said, "What am I supposed to do? Eat a steak for breakfast?" And I said, "I just pulled 2 steaks out of the fridge that are sitting on our bench right now." Yes, have a steak for breakfast.
And that's like one of the best breakfasts ever, right? Or like some leftover, like I love like leftover taco meat or something.
Yes.
Like in the cast iron pan with a couple eggs cracked on top and some salsa, you know, make it fun. People think of like, I don't know, everybody comes up with boring stuff. In fact, we just put out a new blog article on high protein breakfasts that have all sorts of different options for you, including many egg-free ones, right? So there's another resource for you right now, but give yourself that experiment, choose 3 from that article and report back. It's usually a positive shift.
Amazing. I'm so glad we're on the same page with so many things, which I knew we would be. But I've loved having you here. Thank you so much for all of your work and all of your knowledge and your energy today. And hopefully we can do this again in the future.
Yeah, thank you.
Amazing. Bye.
Bye.